joining us from various places. So I will start. People can join us as we proceed. I would like to welcome all of you to our event today. I'm Aurelian Craiuțu, and it's my great pleasure to welcome today Professor Ryan Hanley, who will be joining us from Marquette, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Ryan is a professor now of political sciences at Boston College. Prior to joining Boston College, he years at Marquette University and earned his PhD from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. Ryan, a specialist on the political philosophy of the Enlightenment period. He has written extensively on Adam Smith, a couple of books, 3 books actually. Most recently, a short book called Our Great Purpose, Adam Smith on Living a Better Life, published by Princeton in 2019. Love's Enlightenment, Rethinking Charity in Modernity, Cambridge, 2017. And he also just published 2 books on the political philosophy of Fénelon and a selection from Fenelon's moral and political writings, published by Oxford University Press this year in 2020. Today's talk will be focused on the political philosophy of Fénelon, a thinker that remains largely unknown in the talk. Will elicit a response from our own graduate student, Quanggu Zhao, who will be talking briefly in response to Professor Hanley's presentation. And after that, we will be taking question and answers. I'm going to ask you in the chat room, and I will be inviting, I like to invite 2 people at the same time to ask questions and give Ryan an opportunity to elaborate a little bit on both of them. Without further ado, I'd like to thank again Ryan for accepting our invitation. Thank you for taking time to be with us. And well, welcome back. It's the second time when Ryan is speaking in our Tocqueville program lecture series, and it's a particular great pleasure for me to welcome a friend whom I've been very close for many years. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Aurelian, and indeed thanks to the Tocqueville Forum and to the Ostrom Workshop. It really is a great pleasure and an honor to join you for a little bit. And Aurelian, I share the disappointment of not being able to meet in person. I have very fond memories from my last visit to Bloomington. I see the great Fabio Rojas here on the screen as well, and it pains me that we can't be doing this face to face, but that time will come again, surely. I also know I'm acutely aware of the fact that it's Friday afternoon. We all spend far too much time on Zoom. I have no intention of lecturing too long. What I thought I'd do was to use an opening few minutes to lay out the case on a couple of different fronts. As Aurelian mentioned earlier this year in March, wonderful time to release a book, by the way, March 2020. Oxford published 2 different projects. One was this monograph, an interpretive monograph on the political philosophy of Fénelon. And the second was a selection of translations from Fenelon's moral and political writings designed to be a companion volume. I think what we sent around in advance was the first chapter of the monograph. And I'm not sure how it was labeled, but it was, in fact, it comes from the 4th chapter of the Correspondence, this remarkable letter to Louis XIV that Fenelon wrote and that I prepared a translation of. My hope is that we'll be able to talk about, as much as we want, my interpretation, but also Fenelon's ideas, because I wrote the book and I made the translation really in the hope of getting his ideas out there and having some more purchase. So I'd like to, after saying just a few words on 3 different fronts, move to Q&A and indeed to Quangju's comments, which I'm very much looking forward to as well. So with that in mind, let me I'll take about 20 minutes or so to lay out some basic thoughts on 3 different fronts. One is quite simply, why Fenelon? Fenelon's name is hardly canonical today, so I think that a few words are in order as to simply why one might study him and might wish to read him today. A second front, I'd like to say just a few words about what my interpretive study wants to contribute. There is an enormous Francophone literature, though not a large Anglophone literature on Fenelon, and I do try and cut out some new interpretive edges. And so I'd like to lay those out just as quickly and clearly as I can. And third and finally, and I hope this will lead into discussant comments and Q&A more generally, I'd like to say a few words about Fenelon now. I am a historian of political thought, but I also believe that the history of political thought can contribute importantly to our understanding of contemporary political moments. And I think Fenelon has a lot to offer on that front. And I'll try and say just a few brief words. So let me start with the first, which is quite simply why Fenelon? It's a question that it can be answered, I think, in a variety of ways. I self-identified as a historian of political thought, and those that do what I do might simply answer in terms of influence. Fenelon's influence on the Enlightenment in particular was genuinely monumental. Some of you I know will know his extraordinary significance for Montesquieu and especially for Rousseau, both of whom praise Fenelon to extraordinary lengths and draw extensively on his ideas. But his influence, it turns out to be much more widespread. His main political work, Telemachus, was in fact the best-selling work in all of 18th century France after the Bible. And in fact, his influence is hardly limited to France alone. And I opened the monograph with this brief little roll call of Enlightenment figures who praised Fenelon to the skies. And under that, in addition to Montesquieu and Rousseau, you find the names of, in the UK, of Bentham and Hume. Further abroad, you find Goethe and Leibniz. In the New World, one finds Jefferson, all the way up to Andrew Jackson, who, if you can believe it, in the 1820s, was still papering his private residence with Fenelon wallpaper drawn from Telemachus. So this is, I say all of that just to say that there's significant influence or evidence of influence. And then I think is an exciting discovery for a historian of political thought. But I have to say that influence tracing or reception history really isn't what led me to Fenelon, but rather something more substantive. And I think that Fenelon develops a set of substantively novel and quite insightful political ideas that really deserve the attention of political theorists. And my main goal in the monograph is to lay these out with an eye towards the scholarship. And so thus the second thing that I want to try and do here in the introductory remarks, which is to very briefly lay out how I understand Fenelon's key contributions and what I want to do with those. Again, in the monograph itself, I make continual reference to this really voluminous Francophone scholarship. And I won't try and get into the weeds here, though I'm happy to take up more specialized questions in Q&A. I only want to note for now 3 ideas on which I try and stake out some new interpretive ground within the familiar positions on Fenelon. The first concerns the relationship of Fenelon's political thought to his theology and to his spirituality. And Fenelon, has to be said at the outset, was not simply famous as a political theorist, either in his day or our own, but also for his contributions to moral theology, and especially for his articulation of a very specific doctrine, which is the concept of pure love. Now, this is a very complex theological debate dating to the last quarter of the 17th century, and it got the Archbishop Fenelon in a great deal of hot water, both with king and with pope. But the key point I want to focus on substantively is Fenelon's treatment of the possibility of what he called, quote unquote, disinterested love. And that is quite simply a pure love that is pure insofar as it is free of all taint of self-love. And this point is central to his theology, his ethics, his letters as a spiritual advisor. We have 18 volumes of Fenelon's correspondence. And again, individuals write him for advice. And his continual refrain is the necessity of transcendence of self-love for happiness, both in this life and beyond. But what I want to focus on, and what I try to focus on in the monograph, is not the spiritual aspects of this claim, but why it matters for politics. And the claim that has been put on the table by a number of interpreters and has really become to be an accepted claim within the literature is that Fenelon's primary goal as a political teacher, and he was a political teacher, was to teach political rulers to become pure lovers. And this may well be the most ubiquitous claim in the literature on his political thought. The idea that Fenelon was encouraging real rulers to try and purge all taint of self-love and to become genuinely disinterested, pure lovers of the people and of the good. It seems to me that this idea gets something crucially right, but in another sense is also crucially wrong. What it gets right is that Fenelon indeed saw self-love as deeply problematic politically. And one of his key goals as an educator of princes, and indeed the grandson of Louis XIV, was to attempt to manage self-love and attempt to redirect self-love into healthier rather than pernicious forms. Louis XIV was a famously self-loving man, to say only the very least. He is a man obsessed with glory and grandeur and what a less charitable reader might call vanity. And these forms of self-love, Fenelon thought, were deeply destructive for the French politics of his day, and the people paid the cost. So I think that the literature gets right the diagnosis of the problem. Where I think it gets something wrong is the remedy that it attributes to Fenelon. Quite simply, as Fenelon himself understood pure love as a remedy for self-love, the pure love that saints exhibit requires the total excision of all concern for the self. He uses language of annihilation of the self. And Fenelon does think that this is a central part of the calling of those who aspired to spiritual excellence. He did not, however, think that it was possible or indeed even desirable for real rulers in real polities to aspire to exercise their self-love across the board. To do so, in fact, Fenelon, I think, is quite clear about this, would be nothing less than political disaster. And I think here is where Fenelon's interest as a political thinker lies. He understands pure love as a normative goal, but he also is deeply aware of the ways in which the world of spirituality and the world of politics differ. And I do think he's a consistent Augustinian and someone very deeply conscious of the difference between the city of God and the city of man. But suffice it to say for now that within the city of man, Fenelon does not think that it would be healthy or ever possible to excise self-love entirely. The goal is not to annihilate it in kings and princes, but rather to educate it and to elevate it so that even if it doesn't rise to the highest heights, it becomes less vicious and perhaps even can be beneficial to the people that the king serves. And so with that idea in mind, the idea that Fenelon has a much more qualified political vision of self-love than is sometimes attributed to him, let me turn to a second political idea that I examine in the monograph. And this is related, and this concerns Fenelon's ostensible idealism. Fenelon's critics, of which there have been many over the years, have long painted him as something pie in the sky, as perhaps wanting to return to a lost golden age. And I think there are, one understands the textual reasons for this. And Fenelon does paint in glowing pictures certain visions of a before the flood idyll in which human nature and political life was pure. That said, I think it's every bit as wrong-headed to say that, that Fenelon wanted to turn back in practical terms and in real polities to recover this normative ideal, as it would be, say, to think that Rousseau, who also described the before the flood stage of natural man, I think it would be every bit as misguided to say for Fenelon, as some have said for Rousseau, that he wishes to turn back and practically instantiate a return to the natural man of the first part of the second discourse. Point blank, not only do I think Rousseau was too sophisticated for that, I'm quite sure that Fenelon was too sophisticated a thinker to ever be under the impression that we could somehow turn back the clock. Instead, I think that Fenelon understood in a very deep sense that political reformers have to work with what we've been given. And here I emphasize Fenelon's, and this will hopefully warm the cockles of Aurelian's heart, I think that Fenelon is quite moderate and deserves to be seen as a political moderate. And indeed, I want to make the claim that he is moderate, not just because we have to work with what we've been given, but we have to work with a very specific side of what we've been given. And that is a side that makes Fenelon not just moderate, but also modern. That is, Fenelon, I think, is always conscious of the fact that he's writing for a world not of ancient republics, but indeed large, modern, imperial, and commercial states, the realities of life on the ground in mid-17th century Europe. My sense, and what I tried to argue in the book, is that he frames his efforts at political reform and his teachings on political reform continually within the lens of a deep awareness of the specific issues that face mid-17th century France politically and economically, and that far from being a naive idealist, he is interested in instantiating political reforms that the French are capable of taking up and working with. One of the documents that I translated in the collection is a truly remarkable short manuscript, and a very difficult short manuscript. It seems to be prepared 1712 for the sake of the reform of all of the institutions of France. That is, Louis XIV died in 1715, sensing that his own student, Louis XIV's grandson, may ascend to the throne. Fenelon gathered with two of the other leaders of the political resistance to Louis XIV and drew up a comprehensive set of what is called plans of government, it's also called the Tables of Chaulnes, Chaulnes being the country estate of one of his fellow reformers. And they are quite literally tables. The manuscript is laid out in the form of, on each folio page, a different heading. And the headings include such things as the military, commerce, nobility, church, justice, and he goes on down and he lays out in a series of bracketed entries the practical reforms of institutions. And it's an extraordinary document, and I hope we can talk about that a bit, especially because I lost endless hours of my life trying to recreate on the printed page with the typesetters what this document looked like in the archives of Saint-Sulpice. I hope that we did it justice, because it's an extraordinarily important document for understanding this moment, both of what France might have been. I'll give away the secret that these plans were never instantiated because Fenelon's protege died of measles right after they were written. But also they give an indication both of a different potential path for France, but also of Fenelon's own deep awareness of the need to tailor institutional reform to the limits and exigencies of current political situations. And so I say all of that to say that Fenelon, I believe, was deeply moderate and also deeply modern in his orientations as a reformer, and that this is a part of the story that deserves more attention than I think it's been given, at least in certain quarters. All right, so those are two of the ideas that I want to put forth. The idea that Fenelon is both moderate and modern, and also that Fenelon deserves to be seen not as trying to instantiate pure love in a political sense. Third, by way of the outset, one other idea that I wanted to put forth in the monograph is the idea that Fenelon deserves to be seen not just as a political thinker, but indeed as a political philosopher. And I realize that in the circles that many of us run, this is something of a term of art. And as somebody that was trained at both Cambridge and Chicago, I understand all the different inflections of these particular terms. What I mean by this is not the sorts of ways we distinguish between political thinker and political philosopher today in a methodological sense. Instead, I have something very specific in mind with the concept of political philosopher as applied to Fenelon. And that is that, in my understanding, Fenelon's main contributions on substantive fronts continually come down to an original distinction that he is always trying to make between two different versions of substantive goods, what he continually calls true goods and false goods. As he comes to the ideals of political courage, he distinguishes true courage from false courage. When he describes wealth, he uses the terms true wealth and false wealth. When he describes glory, the great goal of Louis XIV himself, he distinguishes true glory from false glory. We see, I think, across all of the different political goods that Fenelon engaged, a real concern to distinguish the true versions from the false versions. And in that sense specifically, I think that Fenelon is a philosophical thinker and deserves to be understood through the lens of philosophy. Aurelian remarked on the Descartes texts that are over my right shoulder. And at least in this respect, I do think that Fenelon was a good Cartesian, very concerned to establish truth rules for distinguishing the true and the false, especially in politics. Okay, with all that said, let me bring to a conclusion these opening remarks by very briefly turning to a third and last area that I outlined at the outset. And that concerns what Fenelon quite simply might have to offer us today, how he might inform our debates as political theorists, as political scientists, potentially as engaged citizens. And here I see Fenelon as having a great deal to contribute on at least three discrete fronts. The first is economic. Aurelian made mention to the fact that a great deal of my earlier work has been on Adam Smith and 18th century political economy. But I think that Fenelon deserves great credit for his remarkable insights a century before Adam Smith into both the promise and the limits of market societies. And one of the things that Fenelon opens up is this really remarkable understanding and indeed defense of free trade against mercantilism. Fenelon understood Colbert's mercantilism as deeply pernicious. And indeed, 100 years before, Adam Smith was engaged in the same campaign against mercantilism of a slightly different sort. Fenelon, like Smith, wanted to defend the value of free trade. What makes Fenelon especially interesting, though, is his powerful and consistent defense of free trade in international arenas is tempered by a careful distinction between necessary goods and luxury goods. That is to say that Fenelon stands at a headwater that before the age of Mandeville on down, in which this intimate association between luxury and freedom of trade, before that had become established dogma. And indeed, Fenelon opens up, I think, a very interesting third way that's both substantively interesting and, as a historian of political thought, historically interesting in his theory of the free trade of necessary goods. I know a number of you know your Montesquieu very well, but Montesquieu's own distinction between a commerce of economy and a commerce of luxury, I think, is very interestingly anticipated by Fenelon's own articulations of this concept. So I think Fenelon opens up really interesting conceptual areas of how to understand the value of free markets that are somewhat different from both how the later 18th century and we today tend to understand them. A second front beyond economics is religion. Fenelon was, to say the very least, deeply interested in the church-state relationship. And more importantly, perhaps, he's deeply interested in the place of religion in politics. Insofar as these are living questions for us today in various inflections, one aspect of Fenelon's treatment, I think, is especially interesting, and that is his focus on the ways in which religious belief and religious institutions can serve as a limit on certain types of power, and especially executive power. Fenelon is very interested in tempering divine right claims, even as he is a sincere and in many ways, not always, Orthodox Catholic. But when we see him as indeed a contemporary of Locke, which he was, and on the other side of the channel, in many ways fighting a very similar battle to the conception of divine right that Locke is responding to in Filmer, one can see that Fenelon opens up a new horizon for the political function of religion, and indeed a subtle and interesting way of understanding the relationship of church and state that is, maybe one wants to say, quasi-liberal, though hardly entirely liberal. And with that, let me turn to a last and final point, and I'll end these opening remarks here, is that I think that Fenelon also has much to contribute in how we understand in our contemporary lens political power and its abuses. at the heart of Fenelon's entire project is a thoroughgoing reconceptualization of the nature and proper limits of political power. He develops this response explicitly to the abuses of Louis XIV and his pretensions to absolutism, which I hope we can talk about in the context of that translated letter. As I mentioned, Fenelon goes on to become one of the principal leaders of the organized resistance to Louis and his abuses of power. But his lessons aren't limited to the age of Louis XIV, and I think, in fact, extend powerfully into more modern realms. One thing that I was struck by at the time of writing up the research on the project was the degree of Fenelon's penetration within the remote interest in that expressed in Fenelon under the Vichy government. Sent into exile a number of Parisian intellectuals in Switzerland in 43 and 44, put together a publishing project called the Cri de France, France's Cry. And the first text that they published was Fenelon's, a selection of his political writings. That's simply one way, which was, of course, became a good seller outside of France and banned within Vichy France. That's one way, not the only way, but I think an important way that attests to the way in which Fenelon is a threat to certain illiberal visions of power, and is consciously so, and I think provides us with resources for better understanding its abuses, and indeed for productively prosecuting resistance to these sorts of abuses. Perhaps we can say more about the contemporary moment in Q&A if people want to pick that up. But I wanted at least to sort of sketch out and give a very broad overview of some of the main claims as far as why Fenelon matters, and indeed why I think he matters today, just as a way of motivating our discussion and getting things started.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate your points, and I'd like to invite Kwang-Yu Zhao to give you a response, and after that we will have a question and answer period. Kwang-Yu?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for Professor Hanley's talk on this interesting figure and those important topics in Fenelon. So I'm honored to discuss them here and offer some of my comments on your work. First, maybe I will try to share screen. Here.
I have to, I have one moment here. I'm going to make you co-host if I can. I cannot make you co-host. I don't know why. That's a problem. So I can't. I'm not sure you can share the screen. Try.
Okay. Let me see.
Unfortunately, I don't have an option of making you co-host here, which. Okay.
Hey, I can do it. Hang on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. David would be able. Yeah, thank you. Sorry for the glitch.
There you go.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's just for saving some time, and so my comments consist of 3 parts. I hope Professor Hanley won't feel surprised because I select exactly the same topics you present here, but I think that's because they are important and key to Fenelon. And first, I want to talk about like what I understand as the general contribution by your book and by the translation. Second, I want to talk about Fenelon and the idea of moderation. Lastly, I want to invite all of us to think about Fenelon's project of modernity as emphasized by Professor Hanley here. But before I move to the discussion on Professor Hanley's work, I also want to mention an episode of the French Old Regime, which I think tells something about Fenelon's important role in the French political history. I think Professor Hanley left much room for me to do this. So this is I want to start from a declaration made by Louis XV at the Parliament of Paris in 1766 I won't read it to save some time, and I'm not a perfect speaker in English, and I will leave it to yourself. But as you can see here, this is like an arrogant, adamant statement about his own absolute power. Like I think this indicates the nature of the French absolute monarchy in the 18th century. I think if you remember, this also resonates with Louis XIV's infamous statement, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. And we know that Louis XV was the immediate successor to Louis XIV, who is the Sun King who created this absolutist system. But here I want us to return the tricky year of 1711, when Louis XIV's son and heir, the Grand Dauphin, died. The whole country actually turned their eyes to the Duke of Burgundy, who was the king's grandson and the presumptive heir, now supposed to succeed Louis XIV, who was now aged and ill. And the people also look at the Duke's famous tutor, our protagonist today, the Archbishop Fenelon, who might have become the chief minister or advisor if the Duke of Burgundy ascended to the throne. In fact, the Bishop Fenelon was also preparing for his pupil's rise to power, by crafting a plan of reform with his political allies, the so-called tables of Shon. I didn't know how to pronounce it until you pronounce it. So I think that's very interesting, but unfortunately, all such hope clashed when the young Duke died of measles the next year, and his young son succeeded Louis XIV in 1715 and became Louis XV. So my question is, what would happen if Duke of Burgundy had become the King of France rather than his son? Maybe we would never know that, but historians know one thing, that is the Duke of Burgundy had a very different character from his son, or how his son would later be. We know that Louis XV was everything but a moderate man. He had numerous official mistresses and numerous unofficial ones. And Duke of Burgundy was a different type of man, and in fact, I think it was largely due to the education of his teacher, Fenelon. I want to show some materials here. This is the depiction of the change to Duke of Burgundy after Fenelon took over his education. And you can see that this young Duke at the beginning was not really a good boy. He was typically a spoiled prince, having very bad temper. But after Fenelon took over, some magical change seems to have happened. And we should remember that the famous books, Telemachus, the Dialogue of Dead, the Fables, were all composed by Fenelon during this period of time to educate his young prince. And actually they worked. Fenelon later, as the observers said, become a very lovable, moderate guy dedicated to his political obligations. So my point is that it would consider this, if we take this as a fact, it would be very hard for us to imagine that if Fenelon still then became the King of France, and he would have made that kind of arrogant declaration about his absolute power like Louis XV did. In fact, if we look at Fenelon's proposal of reform in the translation, a key idea is to strengthen the representative system. Fenelon strongly advocated to restore the Estates General and local assemblies, where the deputies from different social classes could deliberate together and make policy for their common interest. He also suggested the separation of state and church, but also suggested a more balanced relationship between them. So I think the core idea of Fenelon's political thought is to constrain the arbitrary use of power of the ruler, maybe through the doctrines of moderation and love. So what I want to tell is by this story is that I want to say that maybe the unfortunate fate of the Duke of Burgundy and his tutor can be seen as a missed opportunity to build a moderate and constitutional monarchy in France. And perhaps we can see it as a missed opportunity to avoid later French Revolution, or at least make the transition to modern democracy smoother, less bloody, perhaps. So we now see the important role of Fenelon in the French political history. Now we are lucky to have Professor Hanley's contribution to this subject. So first, I think this contribution is clear. This is the first monologue on Fenelon's political thought in English, and I think definitely is a milestone. What is important is that Professor Hanley, according to his talk, like he wants to correct a prevalent misunderstanding of Fenelon, which is that Fenelon was an idealist or utopian writer who wanted to restore the golden age, the irretrievable past, or rather he was a radical moralist who wanted to apply strict moral doctrines to real political life. This is because people used to think that the two model cities in Telemachus, the Baetique and the Salente, as representing Fenelon's own political ideals. And I think Professor Hanley clarifies this mystery in two ways. First, now we have the translation of the political writings. We can see that Fenelon knew what was happening in reality, and he proposed many, I think, practical strategies to deal with these problems. And he was an important political figure. He exercised some power, and he know real stuff in politics. So therefore, we no longer should rely solely on Telemachus, a literary work for the education of a young prince, to understand Fenelon's political ideas. But this is not to say that Telemachus is not important. On the contrary, I think the political writings can help us, can throw new light on how we should read Telemachus as an important work in political philosophy. Maybe it is still the most important political writings by Fenelon. And so here comes the second contribution. I think that is Professor Hanley provides a very comprehensive, insightful, and I think fair interpretation of Telemachus as a work in political philosophy. Even though this book is not solely dedicated to Telemachus, it shows that Fenelon's political ideas are much richer than how people used to see in Telemachus. So I think you already see that from Professor Hanley's talk. So I also found some interpretation very fascinating, like the idea of hope in chapter 6, like how it develops in Telemachus, and also the idea of the ladder of love in chapter 7. So this book makes me think that like Plato's Republic and Rousseau's Emile, Telemachus is a profound work that has, I think, high-end educational aims and systematic moral reasonings. So this book is very influential during the French Enlightenment, and it deserves careful treatment by political theorists. The only reservation I would make for Professor Hanley's interpretation is that I think sometimes he appears too sympathetic to Fenelon to point out Fenelon's clear preference for a hierarchical society, and thus perhaps understates the problem of paternalism. Maybe you can talk about that. A general question is a methodological one. Like I'm wondering how you navigated in such rich and diverse discourses of good regimes in Telemachus. Sometimes they look quite different and maybe incompatible. And is there a best regime theory in Telemachus? And how could you say that Fenelon prefers one to another? So that's my question. The second part about my comments is the idea of moderation in Fenelon. So I think this book shows that Montesquieu's idea of moderation in the spirit of the laws did not come from nowhere. We can regard Fenelon as a bridge between Bossuet's theory of divine and absolute rights of the king and Montesquieu's more liberal conception of political power. As this book shows, Fenelon follows the principle of moderation in all aspects in his thought, namely that he always preferred a middle path between extremes. For Fenelon, a balanced point between extremes is to be sought in political life. Therefore, he criticized both the despotism of kings and the despotism of the multitude. He once said, quote, "The despotism of the multitude is a mad and blind power which often turns against itself. The wisdom of any government, whatever its form, consists in finding a medium between these two frightful extremes, in a liberty moderated solely by the authority of the laws," quote ends. Perhaps this idea, I think, is closely relevant to our contemporary political life. So my reflection on this part is that I think to be moderate or to find a balance, you also need some extent of progressive vision, which means that you need to understand the new reality on the ground. You even need to predict what kind of new changes will come in the future. So Fenelon is still a fascinating case here. And because like his view was, in my eyes, it was quite progressive at his time. Look at his essay on the education of the girls. He knew the new commercialism, the international trade, and he understands the new situation of the international relations. So he was not nostalgic about the past. But at the same time, was that enough? I also think about, like, did Fenelon also recognize other important trends at the moment? For example, the emergence of modern nation state, which will bring huge changes to the idea of state power. And did he understand that the new commercialism would bring like a huge change to the social structures of Europe? And did he understand that the rise of the bourgeoisie could also like pose new challenge to French politics? I don't think I want to require too much of Fenelon, but I think thinking about these questions could decide how appealing we think Fenelon's moderate political vision is. I think different readers will have different answers. Last, and I want to address and raise some questions about Professor Hanley's depiction of Fenelon as a modern political philosopher. I think this is a big thing in the book. So on appearance, I think Fenelon's modern spell was not that conspicuous, unlike Machiavelli, who built a new political theory on a low but solid ground, using Leo Strauss' term, and taught how not to be good in politics. Fenelon still believed in the moral good in politics, and his teachings to the prince sounded very much in line with the classical and the Christian traditions. Neither did Fenelon share the Hobbesian anthropology, where the isolated modern individuals sought self-preservation in the state of nature and later built the social contract on that ground. So the modern individual liberty, defined as the freedom from interference, is not a fundamental doctrine for Fenelon. But at the same time, Fenelon still valued, I think he still valued human freedom, and his critique of despotism seems very liberal to me. At one point, Professor Hanley claims that Fenelon's conception of political obligation contains the idea of individuals' natural right, and therefore is, quote, evidence of a quite modern and egalitarian conception of political obligation, quote end. I'm not sure I see Fenelon went as far as that. Maybe you can talk about that, why you think so. I think Fenelon was still one step apart from the modern conception of politics. I think this is due to the fact that the role of reason in Fenelon's political philosophy was ambiguous. It is unclear to me what reason meant for Fenelon. For Fenelon, even according to your book, even the pure philosophical reasoning implied too much self-love or vanity to be a solid ground for the pursuit of good life. So this makes Fenelon, I think, distinct from both the classical political philosophy. Think about how reason is important to Aristotle and Plato, and also different from the modern political theory, the social contract tradition. Put in other words, I think Fenelon was too committed as a Catholic archbishop. He was too committed to the Christian virtue of humility and docility. he was far from a champion for Machiavelli's virtue, which means the ambition to become the master of oneself, to even become the master of one's own fate, fortuna. This makes him apart from the fashion of the modern republicanism, maybe. And in my eyes, there was not a Machiavellian moment in Fenelon. But I think if we move one step back, I think we can still try to appreciate Fenelon's project of modernity. In a Fenelonian way, modernity should not be merely a relentless progress of rationalization, which leaves us in a cold iron cage, using Weber's term. In the Fenelonian tradition, there's a more nuanced relationship and balance of reason and sentiment. A Fenelonian project of enlightenment would underline the refinement of the sentiment of love, in addition to the use of reason. I think by reading Fenelon, we acquired an opportunity to rethink and perhaps redefine the project of modernity and enlightenment. In this sense, I think Professor Hanley already brings his expertise on the Enlightenment tradition of love to his interpretation of Fenelon. So in a conclusion, I think this Professor Hanley's book brings a fascinating subject to our horizon. It shows that Fenelon is a systematic political philosopher who understands the world in its entirety, using Professor Hanley's words. So I also think Fenelon's theory of love also has some relevance to our contemporary life, which I think is characterized by a consumerism that often goes beyond necessary needs, maybe out of control. So think about how unsustainable our way of life in the modern time is. So reading Fenelon may serve as a caveat or antidote to our problems today by invoking a sense of human humility in us and making us rethink our appropriate position in the universe. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwang Yu. I would like to invite Ryan to say a few things in response to your points, and then we will take questions from the audience. I would like to remind you that my preference would be to have you identify yourself by raising your hand electronically through the reactions button, which is on the bottom side of the screen, and that will give us a chance to proceed in a more orderly fashion. Ryan.
I'll take just a very few minutes, but I think it's incumbent upon me to begin by thanking you, Kwang Yu. Those are wonderful comments. First of all, it's a joy to find somebody on this side of the Atlantic that has read as much Fenelon, as might be even as enthusiastic, approximating my own enthusiasm. But those are really very insightful and speak to a number of the themes that I think are important in Fenelon, and I tried to bring out in the interpretation. I'll try and do justice to them as briefly as I can, and I'm sure I won't do full justice. But first, I love the way you motivated the comments. The opening quotation from Louis XV, I could imagine Fenelon rolling over in his grave. Would that the Duke of Burgundy had become Louis XV, and would that Fenelon had become prime minister, as you rightly say he likely would have. That statement was incredibly striking and far eclipses anything that I know from Louis XIV's own hand in terms of encapsulating l'état c'est moi, this idea of the self. Where I think Fenelon is fascinating is the way in which he sought to resist that precisely by encouraging in the ruler and in the Duke of Burgundy, an appreciation for the ways in which the king is not the state, precisely because of the entity of the people, which is properly understood as having interests distinct from the state and from the king. And while a harmony of those interests is to be desired, the unification of those interests and the obliteration of all distinction between them, Fenelon thought was terribly pernicious. And I think you brought that out very nicely in your comments. And I'll use it as a way of just very briefly responding to some of the most important themes that you raise. This idea that a solicitude for the well-being of the people qua people, that I think runs deep through Fenelon's self-conscious spirituality as well as his political thought. And I think it's one of the things that leads him again and again to emphasize the people's well-being in distinction to the well-being of the ruler. Does that make him, as we tend to think of things today, an egalitarian, a democrat, or even a proto-revolutionary? I think the answer has to be no. That is to say, even though the revolutionaries themselves, I mean, you can go now to Paris still and see on the pediment of the Pantheon, he's right up there along with Mirabeau and Rousseau as one of the great seeming fathers of the revolution. But that really requires abstracting from a number of things in Fenelon, not least of which obviously is Catholicism, but also, as Kwangju rightly notes, his commitment to, I think, what you called hierarchy. And that's part of social rank and social class is part of his scheme, and he's not a full egalitarian. But he is a remarkable step on the way towards democratization and appreciation of at least popular well-being. His moves towards trying to strengthen representative government, his moves towards trying to lessen the hold of top-down absolutism and the distribution of offices. All of these are very important steps on a road towards many movements that would come later. And I think he deserves, in many ways, our credit, even as he has these undeniably hierarchical or aristocratical moments, this understanding that he really is a very important and nuanced stage along the way. As far as his wisdom goes and the way his moderation speaks to today, I love the passage that you quoted, Kwangju. It seems to me incredibly important. And it may well be that Fenelon's greatest lesson for today comes in his very clear articulation of the rule of law and the superiority of law to the will of the ruler. In the Dialogues on the Dead, especially, he brings this out in remarkable ways for the 1680s. And if anything in my translation gets out there and gets circulated and gets posted on Twitter, as some people have started doing, it's those passages that I think deserve the most currency and are really living for us today. Finally, in terms of his degree of being a modern, I think you're right to say that we have to think very carefully about how we position him as a modern. He is most explicitly not a Hobbesian. He is also very self-consciously not a Machiavellian, even as he writes A Mirror for Princes, he's trying to be an anti-Machiavelli, as many later readers would recognize and say. And I think you're right to say that he lacks, and this is a blindness in his thought, a robust definition or articulation of freedom, especially freedom as we've come to understand it in the modern way. Where I think, though, his non-modernity may be most interesting, though, is the degree to which he is consciously trying to bring into a modern understanding of politics a, if not classical political orientation, a very self-consciously Christian and Catholic orientation. That is to say, I'm not sure that the issue on the table is as much a commitment to humility and docility, the sorts of things that you found especially worrisome, Kwangju, but especially his commitment to tempering the rule of reason by an appreciation of the place of faith. And that is, I have to say, an unmodern orientation, self-consciously so on his part. But I think it's there we'd want to go if one either wanted to push back against the claim that he's a modern, or perhaps celebrate a productive way in which questions of faith and questions of liberal political commitments might be unified. So there might be some interesting ways in which his unmodernity in that particular respect could be creatively applied within a modern context. But on the whole, those are really tremendous comments. If you have them written up, I'd really enjoy having a record of those. They're really, I think, very helpful, and I hope will lead to some continued conversation here.
Thank you, Ryan. I just want to confirm the names that are on my list here. I have Francesca, Jamie, Mark, Razvan, Konstantin, and Charles, and I will invite two each so that it gives you some time to process the questions and answer different aspects of them. And I have a question of my own, which I will add at the after this. So let's start with Francesca and Jamie. Francesca, welcome back to see you and that wonderful library inherited from your father.
Thank you so much, Aurélien. I was fascinated
Francesca,
by
yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So
Yes.
I was fascinated by this very insightful discussion, and I would like to hear more. I found your arguments, Professor Hanley and Kwang's remarks very interesting, but I would like to know, how was Fenelon seen by his contemporaries? I was convinced by the practical side of his thought, but was he used in America, let's say? Did he have any influence on states and governments that emerged after he thought was, expressed in books and so forth? So how was he perceived, and did he have any practical effect later on? Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Jamie, next.
Right. Hi, I really have enjoyed this robust hour of intellectual stimulation. Thank you both. My question refers to the distinction between church and state that Fenelon is working towards. This seems to be a distinction that many philosophers in the 17th and 18th centuries are really concerned about. I've wondered if that's as a response to the deep religious divisions and wars that were like spreading throughout Europe at the time. And we're not talking about just intellectual disagreements. We're talking about Christians killing each other, right? And people fleeing to the United States to escape that kind of persecution. And one instance that occurred when Fenelon, I guess it would have been about 34, would have been the revocation in France, when they say up to 10% of France's population left. They had to flee because they were Protestants and bitterly persecuted. And so I'm wondering, do we see in the historical record any evidence of Fenelon responding directly to that situation or to the other persecution around him?
Thank you, Jamie. Ryan, why don't you take those two questions and then we'll move on, okay? Thank you.
Wonderful. Great questions both. Let me start with Jamie's, the second. I think it's fair to say that the revocation of the Edict of Nantes was one of the central events in Fenelon's life. It's what gave him his first big political jobs. He was sent to some of the Protestant strongholds with the responsibility of converting the outliers. A tough gig, as one can imagine. But it turned out to be, on both sides, they appreciated the delicateness of his approach. He was very firm throughout his life in insisting that consciences can't be formed by force, but one has to respect freedom of will. And so he tried to use the gentlest means of persuasion he possibly could and still do the work that Louis XIV commanded him to do. That earned him great respect, and that's what caught the eye of Colbert and brought him then into Versailles as one of the court ministers, or as a court tutor, I should say. It also influenced his later life. We haven't talked about this, but Fenelon was a man who ultimately was condemned by both throne and altar. Both the Pope as well as the king condemned various aspects of his doctrine. And for his, I'll say, sins, he was sent to the north of France, and his bishopric was in Cambrai. Which is, even today, actually, the French still find it to be the edge of the earth. I don't know if anybody's seen this movie, Bienvenue à la Ch'ti, which is the story of this postman that gets sent from Provence up to the north, this wretched, gloomy, gray, rainy place. That's where Fenelon was essentially sent. And it was the borderlands that were being contested in the War of Spanish Succession. And it was mostly Protestant. It was mostly Dutch or Belgian, Flemish speakers. And Fenelon, by all accounts, was deeply charitable and very humane. So we have a lot of evidence that suggests that for all of his role as a converter, he was also somebody that took a remarkably humane conception of the task involved and was deeply concerned with the well-being of individual Protestants, as well as, and I think this is probably where your question was really headed, the great economic costs that came to France when the Huguenots went into exile and took their trades and their business with them. That was an utter disaster, morally, ethically, religiously, and economically, and Fenelon was deeply troubled by it.
Well, actually, I wasn't driving for the economic point. Some of my ancestors served at court because Protestants also were given hereditary court positions, and they had to flee. Yep, so they were some of the early French Huguenot settlers in New York.
Aha. That's good. As it turns out, well, actually, I was going to talk about Fenelon's. Well, maybe this brings us actually to Francesca's question, which is Fenelon's place in the New World. You asked about America. There is this one little episode where Fenelon, early in his life, wanted to be sent to the New World to actually do the conversion of the soi-disant barbarians and savages. And his brother actually came to Canada and was part of one of the many missions that were sent in conjunction with the Jesuits. But I only mention that because you asked about America and the afterlife of Fenelon's thought. In terms of his influence within America specifically, there's a really odd and fascinating story that's been partially told by a scholar at Vanderbilt named Patricia Ward, who tells the story of the fact that Fenelon's afterlife as a religious thinker, especially in America, is not among Catholics, but in fact among Protestant evangelicals that were fascinated by his spiritual teachings and especially his concern for overcoming the self and communing with God. And in fact, the translations that we have of Fenelon in English are largely Protestant evangelical presses in the United States that have produced non-scholarly translations with no scholarly apparatus or footnotes, but extracts of his spiritual teachings, all focused on, one is titled Letting Go, for example. And so that was a really fascinating part of the story of his religious influence. In France, and the story with Catholics is obviously very different, as I'm sure you know. As far as his political influence, it's felt in political philosophy in different quarters. Montesquieu has been brought up several times, and I think that's very important. One part that we haven't talked about was his practical influence as a theorist of international relations. As a matter of simple historical fact, Fenelon is the first to articulate in Western Europe a realist theory of balance of powers among states based upon equality of power rather than single hegemons keeping peace. Very interestingly, no less a thinker than Kenneth Waltz, one of the great IR theorists of 20th century American political science, is the one to have noted that. And later discussions of European integration did continually refer to these very interesting passages in this text where he lays that out. It's in the supplement of the Examination of Conscience, which I also was very keen to translate for this volume. So aside from even domestic rule, which is the questions he's most often associated with, this question of international balance of power has actually had Fenelonian influence. There's a great piece that Bruno Bernardi published in French on this topic. I can send a citation if it's of interest, but I think that's one of the really interesting places that his practical politics really becomes influential, European balance of power.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to all three of you. I'd like to invite Mark and Rezvan to ask their questions, and then Ryan, you'll take a second round, okay? Mark Yellin.
Hello, it was great to hear you, Ryan. Haven't seen you for a while, and really enjoyed the talk and the comments and the questions from everybody. I guess I want to maybe poach a little bit in Aurelian's neck of the woods and ask about moderation, because you make, I think a very convincing case that Fenelon should be considered a moderate and should not be considered a radical, the way the French revolutions maybe I think you were saying misappropriated him for their own purposes. But I guess, so my question is, how do you draw this distinction of moderation and radical, looking at something like Fenelon? And also this ties into the question of how was he seen in his own time? Because just the idea of questioning the authority of the sovereign, the divine sovereign monarch, is itself a kind of radical act. And going back and looking at institutions of the past to recover them so they could be a restraint on abuses of power, that can be seen as kind of radical, and from the regime point of view, it's you could be seen as an opponent and a radical, and maybe that there's other really crazy people out there that are even more opposed, but though it's like those distinctions aren't being made from the point of view of the sovereign. And I think I'll stop with that.
Okay, thanks. I forgot to introduce Mark. Mark is a senior fellow at Liberty Fund and an old friend of mine as well. Good to see you, Mark. And Razvan Iwan is joining us from Bucharest. Hi, Razvan.
Hi. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk and for the wonderful comments afterwards. My question is about the Augustinian inheritance that you've mentioned. And of course, this is a big thing in 17th century France with someone like Malebranche or Arnaud. And I was wondering about the consequences of this theological notion, this theological influence, and for instance, original sin, and what that means for corrupt human nature and the possibilities of human nature. And given this premise, then about moderation, what you've called Fenelon's moderation. If people and political leaders cannot demonstrate pure love, then the fact that you need to find some middle ground there, is it a question of moderation, or is it better described as some sort of realism, of pessimism, pessimistic realism? That's just the best we can do, right? Nothing more. So that's not really moderation, because you don't have much of a choice to go to extreme.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Razvan. Mark, do you want to add something to your question?
No.
No, okay, I have your hand up here. That's why.
Oh, let me take it down.
We'll lower it. Ryan, it's your turn next. No, I took it down. Yeah, okay.
Again, great questions, both. For Razvan, you're absolutely right that suffused throughout is the question of Augustinianism, both in Fenelon himself and in his age. For whatever it's worth, I just announced I was going to teach my next graduate seminar on Augustine so that I can have the grasp of the 17th century debate that I wish to have. For now and provisionally, let me say, when Fenelon is put into exile, and he essentially stops writing on politics after 1712, and he writes what is by far the longest text in his entire corpus. It is a extended dialogue in which, and the fruit of his labors of several thousand pages that he has been writing in screeds against the Jansenists. He is not himself a Jesuit, but he makes common cause with the Jesuits in attacking what he sees to be the deeply pernicious effects of Jansenism, both on an institutional level and on a moral level in early 18th century France. He's participating in a much larger debate there, but suffice it to say, almost all of that debate turns on the proper understanding of Augustine and the Augustine's understanding of will and grace. And so for whatever it's worth, the next book that I intend to write, which I did not talk about that long writing, I have a book already planned out in my head called The Battle for the Soul of Augustine, which will be precisely on Fenelon's attempt to reclaim an Augustinian understanding of grace, precisely to respond to these Jansenist concerns. Appreciate for saying that hopefully Aurelian will have me back in 20 years when I actually finish that book and we can have a fuller conversation.
You've been so little productive, Ryan. I'm worried about you.
I have other things I need to write too, though. But the second part of Razvan's question is a good one, and that is the distinction between moderation and realism and their relationship. And the point of departure for my opening up these questions in the book is, in fact, a Francophone debate over Fenelon's ostensible idealism and realism, especially on questions of war and peace. That Francophone debate in the literature all comes out of the question of whether Fenelon is a thoroughgoing pacifist or whether he in fact has a just war doctrine. And I very much incline to the latter, I think for demonstrable textual reasons, and that Fenelon deserves to be read as a realist. So it does actually come out, my interest in his moderation comes out precisely from that context. I mentioned that because that shapes what I want to say by way of what it means to be a moderate. And I know I'd be curious for Aurelian perhaps to follow up here. We use moderate to mean all kinds of things. In the wake of the election, people are talking about Biden being a moderate against the progressive left. I mean, there's all these sorts of resonances in what moderation is in a political sense. What I use it to mean is not simply a substantive body of political positions, but a concern for the instantiation of political ideas and a deep appreciation of the limits of practice for theory. I think that Fenelon as a theorist is often very radical. And indeed, Kwangju mentioned earlier the language of Bétique. These are radical political ideas. Pure love is clearly a very radical spiritual idea. But what makes Fenelon so fascinating to me is his deep understanding of how those ideas cannot be instantiated and how they yet can productively serve as pole stars, as conscious ideals to help guide our practical reforms that are limited by the extent of current conditions. So I see Fenelon as somebody who uses self-consciously radical ideas in a way that is tempered by an appreciation of the limits of human beings and of contemporary context, so that we can move in the direction of those ideals, but never naively think that we can fully encapsulate them in real practice. So I think I say somewhere in the book that he uses ideal conceptions for realist ends. And I think that's the moderation that I'm most concerned to effect. And I think that Mark is exactly right. He harkens back to classical ideals, very lofty ideals, and to just bring those up can be seen as radical, but his deep understanding of the practical gap between the ideal and the current reality is what I want to characterize as a substantively moderate position.
Thank you, Ryan. We have two other guests that will be asking questions. Konstantin Vasiliou joining us from Columbia, Missouri, specialist on Montesquieu, I should warn you, Ryan. And then Charles Marriott joining us from Canada, or so. Konstantin first.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay,
oh,
great.
that background again.
I love that. I saw that when it first came on. That's great.
Well, thanks for the great talk, Dr. Hanley. I really appreciated it. So I have a short two-part question in response to your claim that, what we've been talking about now, that Fenelon worked with existing institutions to educate and elevate self-love. So my questions are, did he extensively write about France's system of venality and the purchase of public offices, which Louis XIV had debased during his reign? And did he think it was possible to harness self-love in a manner that could at least incite pure love impulses in circumscribed civic spheres, either among France's nobility of the robe or the crown itself? So that's...
Thank you, Konstantin. Charles next. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. So actually, I was going to ask an Augustine question, but since someone else has, I'm going to pivot to Smith in a way. I'm wondering if you could talk about similar to how you write about Smith, the importance of the perfection of the self for the betterment of society. And if Fenelon has a similar conception of how our improving ourselves and focusing less on our self-interest and self-love may actually benefit society as a whole. So both the relationship between individual improvement and the eventual improvement of society.
Thank you. Ryan.
Yeah, to some degree, we're all shaped by, influenced by, imprisoned by the sort of work that has led up to the work that we do now. And so as interpreters, we're always the product of many different experiences, intellectual and otherwise. And Smith has certainly been a part of those. And one thing that I learned in Smith was the degree of his commitment to the ways in which, and I'll use the same sort of language that I've used here, that self-love can be consciously educated and elevated. Smith understands moral virtue to take several different forms, ranging from the self-interest in a healthy sense of the prudent man, all the way up through the elevated self-interest of magnanimous people, all the way up to what seems to be a transcendence of self-interest conventionally understood of the figure he calls the wise and virtuous man. Much of that Fenelon or Smith rests on a distinction that he uses in response to Mandeville. Mandeville reduces everything to vanity or the mere love of glory. And Smith says something very interesting in response, that there is such a thing as the quote unquote love of true glory. I made a lot of that in Forever It's Worth in the book that I did on Smith. It didn't escape me, and now sort of pivoting a little bit to Constantine's point, that this is the central concept in Fenelon's education of the Duke of Burgundy in Telemachus. That is the redirection of his native love from what he sees as the love of false glory, that is personified or just exemplified in Versailles, to the love of true glory. Now, I don't want to make any claim about historical influence. I don't want to suggest that Smith got true glory from Fenelon. I think the true story is there's a lot of different late 17th century writers that influenced Smith. But at least my work on Smith sensitized me to that side of Fenelon and his concern to improve and to educate and to elevate without trying to extirpate. And on that particular question, what Constantine raises about the harnessing of self-love, I think that that project to raise the Duke of Burgundy to become a lover of true glory is the central educative project that he's trying to effect as a tutor. And it's a fascinating project. And it's in some ways much more complex than trying to encourage one to transcend or to annihilate one's self-love. The love of true glory is a form of self-love. It is not a self-abnegation or an indifference to glory. It is a desire for glory, but in fact, glory that is merited or earned for a certain kind of deed. And I think it's this that he really wanted to encourage in the Duke of Burgundy. And it's a glory that would be earned on the basis not of victories on the battlefield or monumental edifices, but rather for having served the actual and what Fenelon calls the true needs of the people. That doing well and being recognized for doing well. It was a love of that that he wanted to foster, I think Fenelon did in the Duke of Burgundy. And at the end of the day, I think that that's the hook upon which he wanted to make his top-down reforms. I know another part of your question, Constantine spoke not just to the king, but also to the ministers and the question of the selling of offices. And you wrote, did he write, or you asked if he wrote extensively about it. And I wouldn't say that we don't have a formal treatise, but clearly office selling was something that he was going to, he responds to in the tables, the plans of government in particular, and tries to encourage, meritocracy is too strong a word, but is very invested in having the king become a better judge of acumen and ability, and believing that that is the secret to reform of the ministry and to get rid of all this idea that we would be trying to simply bring in more funds by selling offices for the sake of being able to keep armies in the field in these pointless wars. Becoming a judge of merit and character. That is the first job of the prince, and he thinks that Louis XIV has really failed on that particular front.
Thank you, Ryan. I have on the list Anton Liu, who is joining us from Brown University, and I'd like to add then a question of mine. Anton first.
Thank you, Aurelian, and hello,
Make sure to unmute yourself, Anton.
Excuse me? Oh,
it's okay, go ahead.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, so hi, Ryan. Good to see you again.
It's good to see you as well. I think in his bad broadband, Aurelian might have been asking for you to introduce yourself.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. I'm currently a postdoc in political theory project at Brown, and I work on 18th century political thought. So Ryan, my question for you
He's
is,
too modest. He's also the author of a very fine paper on Kant and honor that just appeared in the last issue of the Review of Politics that I have no financial interest, but I recommend it highly.
thank you so much, Ryan.
Yeah.
And my question is pretty much related to this idea of disinterestedness and interest in the idea of pure love. I wonder for Fenelon if there's any difference between being subjectively disinterested and being objectively disinterested. That is it enough for me to feel that I try to be disinterested, even though that may not be the case, as it turns out? And the wider context, this question is embedded, is about the idea of authenticity. I wonder to what extent Fenelon might have some influence on the development of the idea of authenticity, which became more and more important since 18th centuries on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Anton. Ryan, why don't you go ahead and answer this? And if there's time, I'll ask last questions since there's no one on the list.
Yeah, it's a great question. And since we've just mentioned Kant and you use the language of authenticity, looking forward to Rousseau, there has been quite a bit of work and good work that's been done noting the ways in which Fenelon prefigures some of these concerns. The way he doesn't quite use either the language, of course, or the conceptual distinction of subjective and objective. He is, when he treats these themes, he usually treats them in the context of his religious thought and is very conscious of that individuals are always being seen by the greatest spectator of all, and that God sees hearts and minds, and that there can be no hiding from that, even if there are ways of constructing false appearances for men. So I think that that is the point of departure for how he treats these questions, which is very different from how Rousseau or Kant would. But I think as far as the substantive point goes, he's deeply troubled by what we today would call inauthenticity, and what he himself uses the language of not just vanity, but deception and deceit. One of his most damning claims that he continually makes against Louis XIV across his published and unpublished writings is that Louis XIV, in all of his concern with pomp and circumstance, is a deceiver. And the term he uses is un trompeur. And I have to tell you that working on this over the past 4 years, given the outgoing regime in the United States, once you've seen Fenelon use the term trompeur to describe Louis XIV, you can't unthink the image of the current occupant of the White House and how he may or may not compare to the occupant of Versailles. But be that as it may, there is this deep sense in Fenelon that whereas Machiavelli thinks that the external is everything, Fenelon thinks that manipulation of externals is both morally, politically, and spiritually terribly dangerous, and encouraging the Duke of Burgundy to act as he thinks and to present himself in full honesty is central to both his education morally and his scheme for political reform. So even though it's a little bit different inflection from how we come to think of it later, I do think that the seeds of a number of those concerns with so-called authenticity are absolutely central to his political project.
Thank you, Ryan. Here's my question. It's a general one that has to do with your work. As you know, I'm a great admirer of what you've done. You've covered a whole range of authors, from Adam Smith to now Fenelon. You've written books for a scholarly audience, but also the one on Adam Smith, which I really very much enjoyed, is geared towards a general audience. And you've edited texts. Not many people in our generation, and I include myself, have such a wide range. And I'd like you to share with us what you've learned while editing these two wonderful books on Fenelon. I was privileged to attend the Liberty Fund conference and then your own conference in Milwaukee, where we worked through this text, and I learned a tremendous amount from listening to you and those who were with us. But I would like to hear from you what you've learned as you are translating, editing these texts. What would you advise young historians of political thought who are about to start their career learning from you? What do they have to learn from your work on Fenelon and the Enlightenment? Because I consider you as one of the leading historians of Enlightenment political thought. So here we go.
Okay, that's a lot to close with, especially with that very kind compliment. I can think of a couple of things, thinking, I mean, synoptically and globally here. One is, and in fact, I was just, Shaul and I were talking about a version of this a little while ago. I remember when I was finishing graduate school, and one piece of advice that I got was, think about broadening beyond the history of political philosophy. A lot of the historical stuff has already been done. I know what that means, and we often hear this as historians of political thought, that do we really need the 50th new monograph on Rousseau? And I understand where that comes from. At the same time, I firmly believe, and the work on Fenelon taught me this, is that there is a great deal of work left to be done, and there are stones still to be unturned. Not spinning through meaningless erudition and just finding thinkers that, to use Isaiah Berlin's phrase, have been deservedly forgotten by history, but figures that have been undeservedly forgotten. There are projects still waiting to be done that I think can be intrinsically rewarding and have the benefit of helping us get a fuller and more true picture of the way projects evolved and how we got to where we are. So if anything, working on Fenelon, in addition to the great joy intrinsically that it brought me, reminded me of the hopefulness of our enterprise as historians of political thought, that we haven't told the last story. And as tempting as it is to write that 50th interpretation of Rousseau, that some courageous branching out, especially for people at mid-career that have things like the security of tenure, opens up possibilities for new horizons that are still out there. That would be my main takeaway. My other takeaway is translating is hard. Doing it well is extremely hard, at least trying to do it well. But it has the discipline that it requires, and the amount of understanding on a much deeper level that it brings away is really, for me, it was profound. Having worked mostly with Anglophone authors up to now, you never have to translate. It's easy to read fast. By making your own translations, I found that it gave me insight, synthetic connections across the works. Fenelon's corpus is broad and diverse, thousands of pages in manuscript. By doing the slow, solid work, I was able to see connections within his thought and indeed connected to things outside. So like most things in life that are really hard, they paid intrinsic dividends. I'm not expecting that it's going to make the Hanley family wealthy, publishing translations of Fenelon. I think it's a select audience, but I'm really grateful that, that some people are starting to take it up. It was time well spent. And so when I hear cynicism towards translations in that work and editing, I do think that those scholarly labors are really integral and do a service to the community, but also deepen one's own understanding in the ways that only doing interpretive work sometimes can't. So, there's the words of wisdom that come away from 7 years toiling in the attic with Fenelon.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate your answer. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'd like to give Ryan and Kwang Yu a round of applause here, well-deserved round. And if anyone wants to stay a little bit longer, I'm going to stop the recording, but we will have the connection on and talk to Ryan informally. This is the